Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Sergio Laporta, and I am the Interim Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities at Fresno State. And I would like to welcome you to our final lectures of the 2021 Academic Decathlon series. Today's lectures will be on science and music during the Cold War. Our first talk will be by Dr. Frederick A. Ringwald on The Race to the Moon, Old and New. We are grateful that Dr. Ringwald is here with us today to answer questions following his presentation. I will be moderating the question and answer session and ask you to type your questions in the Q&A box, and I will read them out loud for the professor to answer. Professor Ringwald is a professor in the Department of Physics at California State University, Fresno. He runs the astronomy program and is director of Fresno State's Campus Observatory and Fresno State Station at the Sierra Remote Observatories. Professor Ringwald got his BA in astronomy and physics from Northwestern University near Chicago. Got his PhD in physics at Dartmouth College and has done research in England, Tucson, and at Penn State. He taught at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida and has been at Fresno State since 2000. We're grateful for your presence here today, Professor Ringwald, and we look forward to your talk.
Oh, thanks very much, Dr. Laporta. Let me hit share screen, and here we go. Share. And you can see my presentation, The Race to the Moon, Old and New. Or can you? Okay.
Yes, it looks good, Dr. Ringwald.
Okay, good. Okay. This presentation will be about the space race of the 1960s and the new space race, or should I say space races, that are taking shape now. But of course, I have to plug myself first. I run a vigorous astronomy program as part of the Department of Physics with our campus observatory, and these are not my students in front of it. Our remote observatory at a beautiful site in the mountains 47 miles from campus that we usually operate over the internet. Our projects with Hubble Space Telescope, other NASA spacecraft, and observatories worldwide. Students are welcome to participate in hands-on research on exoplanets. Those are planets of other stars, cataclysmic variables, flare stars, black holes, starburst galaxies, and quasars. To provide a little context, the Cold War between East and West, primarily the Soviet Union, referred to as the USSR, which stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the largest of which, of course, was Russia, against the United States from immediately after the end of World War II in 1945 to 1989, although the Soviet Union did not collapse until a couple years later in 1991. The Soviet Union and the US fought on the same side in World War II against the Germany run by the Nazis. And when Nazi Germany fell, the Soviet and the American troops had just enough time to shake hands with each other before they became involved in their own conflict. People said it was amazing how quickly they went from the good guys to the bad guys. The United States had developed the nuclear bomb using nuclear fission, referred to as an atom bomb or an atomic bomb, and had tested one on the New Mexico desert in July of 1945, and then dropped two of them on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So the United States thought it was ahead in the Cold War until just 3 years later, the Soviet Union detonated their own atomic bomb. Scientists in the United States promptly went to work on a nuclear fusion bomb, also known as a hydrogen bomb, 1,000 times more powerful than an atom bomb. The United States detonated the first one in 1952, and the Soviet Union detonated one, tested one just a couple years later in 1954. And later in the 50s, both countries developed long-range missiles, long-range rockets to deliver them around the world, called intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. The Soviet Union had the first one, the R-7, the old Semyorka booster, in 1957, and the United States developed its first one, the Atlas missile, in 1959. So these were some very tense times. The two countries were perpetually at each other's throat, perpetually seemingly spoiling to have a terrible war break out. In 1957, October 4th, 1957, Sputnik 1 was launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan by the Soviet Union. It was the first ever Earth-orbiting artificial satellite, and it was riding on a Semyorka booster, a Soviet R-7 Semyorka booster, which are still very much in use. Mainly not as weapons, but as practical space transport. Sputnik 1 rode the first one into Earth orbit. It was the first ever Earth orbiting satellite. It was basically just a sphere, a metal sphere weighing 184 pounds, and it only carried a radio transmitter that went beep, beep, that any amateur ham radio operator could receive. Therefore, it was widely listened to in the West. Ham radio was basically the internet of its day and a popular hobby in those days, and people with ham radio sets were common all over the world. And so this thing from our geopolitical enemy, the Soviet Union, was flying over our heads and making beep, beep radio signals that any amateur radio operator could receive. It absolutely terrified the West. It was a complete surprise to the West. Up until that point, the United States thought it was ahead in the Cold War because although Russia had a bigger army, the Red Army, the United States had a more advanced Air Force and a bigger Navy. And then, of course, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik 1, the first satellite, something in those days straight from outer science fiction. And there was a panicky reaction in the United States. How could we possibly have let this happen? It was probably the greatest propaganda victory against the United States, really, since Pearl Harbor. It was the first ever orbiting satellite, so you had to explain people what kept it in orbit, why it didn't fall, why gravity didn't make it fall to the ground. The reason being, it's moving too fast sideways. To stay in orbit, a satellite has to move 17,500 miles an hour, which is fast enough so that although the Earth's gravity is pulling on it, it doesn't hit the Earth because it's moving sideways fast enough. Orbiting is like throwing yourself at the ground and missing. What Americans instantly understood was this thing made by the Soviet Union, our geopolitical enemy, was flying over their heads. What would come next? Cameras to spy on them, or maybe nuclear bombs? And all doubts went away less than a month later when Sputnik 2 was launched. It weighed over 1,000 pounds and carried a live dog by the name of Laika. It was sophisticated enough to carry cameras and large enough to carry a nuclear bomb. So the space race was off. Sputnik 1 and 2 established a pattern. The Soviets would often do things twice before the United States did. And this was a trend that remained in effect pretty much well into the 1980s and certainly through the race to the moon in the 1960s. In 1959, the Soviet Union launched their Luna 1 robot. It was the first flyby of the moon and the first spacecraft to escape Earth's gravity and go into orbit around the sun. They also launched the Soviet Luna 2 robot. It was the first spacecraft to make an impact on another world, to actually hit another world, namely the moon. And the Soviet Luna 3 robot, which flew around the far side of the moon and took the first ever pictures of the far side of the moon. This is why most of the features on the far side of the moon facing away from Earth have Russian names. For example, I happen to know that right there is Tsiolkovsky crater. And let me clarify, these were all robots. These did not have humans on board. At the time, they were called unmanned spacecraft. They are no longer called unmanned spacecraft. They are now called robotic spacecraft or just robots. They were robots. Robots have big advantages in space flight in that they don't have to eat, they don't have to breathe, and they don't get upset if they can't come home. But of course, a lot of people have trouble getting excited by robots. Therefore, the desire to put humans into space. And humans can actually do quite a lot of exploration because humans are adaptable. And in particular, can fix stuff if it breaks. So what used to be called manned spaceflight back in the 1960s, for a long time now, actually, have been called human spacecraft. It doesn't make sense to call them manned spacecraft because, for one thing, women had been flying in space since 1963, and commanding spaceflight since 1990. And of course, on the 12th of April, 1961, Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet hero of the Soviet Union, became a hero of the Soviet Union, became the first human to fly in space, or cosmonaut. The United States in 1959 had announced that it was going to launch military test pilots, American military test pilots into space and called them astronauts. The Soviets, since they actually put a human in space first, changed the name to cosmonauts. And now that China is launching humans into space, they call them taikonauts. This is a picture of him about 2 minutes before he got into the spacecraft. This look that you see on his face is what courage looks like. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is feeling the fear, but doing what you need to do anyway. And this is the Semyorka R7 booster that he rode on, just having launched. And this is the Vostok 1 spacecraft, basically just a little metal sphere that he flew all the way around the world in. And he came back to a hero's welcome, was a big international hit. Less than a month later, Alan Shepard became the first American in space on his Project Mercury spacecraft, riding on a Redstone missile. In Project Mercury, he did not get into orbit. He just went up and down, and Yuri Gagarin said about it, yeah, we sent a few dogs up and down, just like Alan Shepard. With this 15-minute and 22-second flight, so 15 minutes and 22 seconds of human experience in space from the United States. Within the month, U.S. President John F. Kennedy announced that America should land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth by the end of the 1960s. Rather a tall order. In 1962, John F. Kennedy and John F. Kennedy, the U.S. president at the time, and Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union at the time, had an argument about missiles. Khrushchev started placing Soviet missiles in Cuba, their ally, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And Kennedy and most of the rest of America did not like that one little bit. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the closest the world ever came to a nuclear war. Khrushchev backed down, and Kennedy quietly removed American missiles from Turkey. But nevertheless, it was scary. The closest the world has ever come to a nuclear war, basically showing you how spaceflight technology was basically so interesting at the time because it was also a key military technology, namely rockets and spaceflight. 1963 to 1965, there was a bumper crop of Soviet space heroes. In 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space flying on Vostok 6. 1964, Voskhod 1 became the first multi-person three-man spacecraft. 1965, Alexei Leonov made the first spacewalk on Voskhod 2. I wanted to put a slide in here to show that this was also when the Beatles became the biggest rock and roll band of all time. 1963, they were a huge hit in England. 1964, they came to America and were a huge hit. 1965, they were the biggest rock and roll band in the world. You couldn't hear them play over the sound of thousands of girls screaming at them. Project Mercury started in 1961 and continued in 1963, put several Americans into space. John Glenn got the most attention because he became the first American to orbit in 1962. He was the fifth man in space, but he was given a big parade because this was taken to signify that America had caught up in the space race. And in particular, the next U.S. human spaceflight project, Project Gemini, with a two-man spacecraft in 1965 to 1966, was when the U.S. duplicated many of the achievements of the Soviet Union. Here is Ed White doing a spacewalk, but pulled ahead, basically accumulating a large amount of operational experience, hundreds of hours of flying in space, and doing sophisticated, complicated things like orbital rendezvous and docking of spacecraft, which would be needed for Project Apollo, the American mission to the moon. In 1966, January 1966, Sergei Korolev died. He was the Soviet chief designer. He was only referred to by the official Soviet newspapers during his lifetime as the chief designer. His real name was never made public in his lifetime. The intent being to unnerve the American public, and it worked like a charm. And in 1966, January 1966, he went into the hospital for a lousy gallbladder operation, and they opened him up and he was full of cancer. He died on the operating table. During the Cold War, of course, quite a few American commentators said, well, this shows you how primitive Soviet medicine is. Well, actually, no. He had been overworking for years, a very stressful lifetime, and neglected his health and did not go to the doctor. And this is what happened. Here he is shown with Yuri Gagarin. He had basically been the brains behind most of the Soviets' early achievements. Sputnik 1, Sputnik 2, and of course, Vostok 1 with Yuri Gagarin and many of the other success stories I've just told you about. January 27, 1967, the first Apollo spacecraft with 3 astronauts on board was getting ready for launch, and a fire broke out in the spacecraft in a pure oxygen atmosphere they used in the spacecraft, and all 3 astronauts died. And it is partly caused by putting schedule up before safety. Again, the race in space was starting to get a little overly intense, especially because in April 23rd of the same year, 1967, Vladimir Komarov became the first human to die in spaceflight on a space mission. During the first flight of the Soviet Soyuz spacecraft, due to inadequate checkout with Korolev out of the way, nobody to check whether everything in the spacecraft was okay, everything screwed up. Korolev said, "Devil machine, nothing I put my hands on works." Here is the remains of his spacecraft that crashed into the Earth at over 200 miles an hour. He was killed. Both countries kept developing their space programs, though. And in 1968, by the next year, both countries had large rockets ready for flight to the moon, because to get to the moon, you need to break free of the Earth's gravity. You have to go the square root of 2 faster than orbital speed, so 25,000 miles an hour. And it takes a lot of energy and therefore a great big powerful rocket to do that. On the 19th of September, 1968, a Soviet N-1 super booster, a moon rocket obviously, was seen on the pad at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, the main Soviet launch facility. And the decision was therefore made to send the next Apollo mission around the moon, Apollo 8. And to show you how much of a rush NASA was in to beat the Soviets to the moon, notice the date. They flew on Christmas Eve. Of all those Apollo missions, this was my absolute favorite because of the sensation that they were so far away and going into such an unknown environment. And that it happened on Christmas Eve was a wonderful touch. Don't listen to old people who tell you how great the 1960s were, because it was a nightmare. And the worst was 1968, the worst year of the 60s. There was civil unrest, protests of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was getting out of control. It was terrible. On Christmas Eve of 1968, though, we had this uplifting experience of 3 astronauts finally orbiting the moon. The long-time promise of science fiction finally was being caught up by reality. And a big surprise was when, as the astronauts passed behind the moon and came from behind the moon and looked at the Earth again, the Earth rise above the the moon's surface. The contrast of a living world and a dead world was just so obvious. One of the astronauts, Bill Anders, said, "Look at that," and took this picture. The commander of the mission, Frank Borman, joked, "Hey, don't take that. It's not on the schedule," and promptly took his own picture. And then the two of them were shoving at each other like kids to get to the window. And the third astronaut, Jim Lovell, said, "Guys, it'll come up again." Jim Lovell noted the Earth from that distance was a grand oasis in the big vastness of space. It was really a striking, stirring moment. And it was all on live television, which in the era of CNN may not sound like a big deal. But in those days, live coverage of a news event in progress was a big deal, especially if it's a spaceship orbiting the moon. 1968 to 1964, the Soviet Zond 5 and 6 spacecraft became the first robotic spacecraft to fly around the moon and return to Earth. Zond 6, just a few weeks before, on the 20th of July, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, Buzz is shown here. Neil had the camera for most of the moonwalk, and he's shown reflected in Buzz's visor. 20th of July, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the Apollo 11 mission became the first humans to land and walk on the moon. And every pundit in existence made lyrical speeches about the unity of humankind, how for one precious moment, we were all one people on Earth. And I felt pretty good. 3 weeks later, Woodstock happened. The Woodstock Festival happened, and all the reporters went up to upstate New York to cover the conference. And life went back to about as normal as it got in 1969. Here, Jimi Hendrix was the headliner, played the Star Spangled Banner famously at Woodstock. I like to point out, though, that Apollo 11 was not the only time that humans landed on and walked on the moon. 1969 to 1972, a total of 12 astronauts on 6 different missions landed on the moon. Apollos 11 through 17. I should point out that Apollo 13 did not land on the moon because they had an onboard explosion and were lucky to get back to Earth alive. It was very suspenseful. A total of 12 astronauts walked on the moon, all Americans, between 1969 and 1972. There's the commander of the Apollo 14 mission, Alan Shepard, formerly America's first man in space. He brought along a genuine 6-iron and spotted a couple of golf balls. The geologists, the scientists hated that because of his lack of preparation, he and Ed Mitchell had gotten lost on the moon. That's why anytime you see a moon rock in a museum, it's almost always an Apollo 14 sample because they really didn't do a very good job of geology. The last 3 missions, Apollos 15, 16, and 17, this is Jim Irwin on Apollo 15, because of all the criticism, did a really wonderful job, took it upon themselves to learn geology and did a really good job. 80% of the samples and more than 80% of the science was brought back in the last 3 missions, including a piece of the moon's original crust, dubbed by the press the Genesis rock, although there are older rocks in the Apollo sample dating back to the origin of the solar system. One thing that helped them collect samples immensely was the last 3 missions, Apollos 15, 16, 17, they brought a car along with them, the lunar rover. What an American thing to do. They brought a car with them. Also, between 1969 and 1972, the Soviets tried to launch their super rocket, their N-1 super booster moon rocket, total of 4 times, and it failed all 4 times. And the last time it blew up right on the launch pad, destroying the launch pad. So in 1976, the Soviet government canceled the Russians' program to send cosmonauts to the moon. They still kept sending robots, though. In 1970 and 1973, the Soviet Lunokhod 1 and 2 became the first robot rovers on another world, namely the moon. And the Chinese have been doing this recently. In 2013, the Chinese Chang'e 3 robot rover landed on the moon in the Sea of Rains. In 2019, the Chang'e 4 robot rover became the first spacecraft to soft land on the moon's far side, and it is still operating. Between 1970 and 1976, the Soviets sent 3 spacecraft, Luna 16, 20, and 24, to become the first robot sample returns from space, namely the moon. And the Chinese are in the process of doing exactly that right now. This mission is happening right now. It landed last week on the moon. The Chang'e robot sample return basically landed on the moon, took a sample, picked up some 2 kilograms of moon rock, and is now in the process of returning this moon rock to the Earth. A new thing I haven't seen the Chinese do before is, for the first time, they put up a Chinese flag on the moon. So the American flag is not the only flag to fly on the moon now. 1971 April, the Soviets launched the first ever space station, Salyut 1. Having been beaten to the race of the moon, they basically were going to show the world they could do something more practical, send a laboratory into space. And at first, it worked great. The Soyuz 11 crew spent 23 days on Salyut 1, setting a new duration and space record at the time. Now there have been people who've been in space for over a year, but 23 days in space, nobody had done it before. And they had live TV broadcasts of the Soviet Union, and they were getting ready to have a parade because the 3 astronauts were going to be heroes of the Soviet Union. Very tragically, when returning to Earth, they became the first humans to die in space because the Soyuz 11 spacecraft sprung a leak, and all the air leaked out in about 30 seconds, and they blacked out in about 30 seconds due to lack of oxygen. And within 3 minutes, they were all dead of the bends, pulmonary embolism. And their automated Soyuz 11 spacecraft had landed, because it was a robotic automated landing, perfectly well. The first indication that anybody on the ground had that anything had gone wrong was when the recovery crew opened the hatch and found the 3 cosmonauts dead. Notice how they're not wearing spacesuits, because the Soyuz was developed originally for two cosmonauts. They realized, hey, we could put 3 in if we just get rid of the spacesuits. They have not done that since. From 1973 to 1991, the Soviets had a highly successful series of space stations, Salyut 2 through 7 space stations. Salyut 3 had a machine gun on it because it was primarily military. This is a big camera designed to spy on the Earth. 1982 and 1984, Svetlana Savitskaya became the second woman in space, the first woman to fly in space twice, and the first woman spacewalker on Salyut 7, and here's Salyut 7. In 1975, during the thaw in the Cold War, the US and the USSR had their first joint flight. The American Apollo and Soviet Soyuz test project, the handshake in space, the two spacecraft docked together in space, and they got out and shared tubes of applesauce with on the cover labels from a well-known brand of vodka in Russia, as recognizable to your average Russian as a Budweiser can would be to your average American. No, they did not have vodka. They were tubes of applesauce, but having a little joke there. 1981 was the first launch of the American Space Shuttle, STS-1, the first space shuttle. 5 shuttle vehicles, winged reusable space vehicles, flew 135 missions from 1981 to 2011. Between 1982 and 1992, 10 shuttle flights carried classified military payloads, all of which are still classified. They're still secret. You can't find out what they are. This worried the Soviets a great deal, the military applications of such a vehicle, again, not being far from anybody's mind. 1983, US President Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, often referred to as Star Wars, a plan to shoot down Soviet missiles, Soviet ICBMs with space-based lasers or other weapons. This has always had problems with feasibility, but nevertheless, it worried the Soviets a great deal as a first strike weapon. The United States, therefore, developed an anti-satellite weapon, an ASAT, launched from an F-16 aircraft. 1967, the Soviets flew their Energia heavy lift booster. This was the first and only rocket since the Saturn V to be in the Saturn V class. Saturn V moon rocket was 7.5 million pounds of thrust. Energia was 7.2 million pounds of thrust. On board Energia was the Polyus Space Battle Station with a laser designed to destroy SDI satellites, American satellites. Polyus failed to reach orbit, and that might have been just as well. It might have saved us a very expensive and dangerous arms race in space. In 1988, the Soviet Buran space shuttle, basically a copy of the American space shuttle, was flown into space on the second and last Energia. Buran flew once, and now it is a park attraction. Kind of sad. The Soviets also developed a smaller orbital interceptor, winged reusable spacecraft. Remember this because I'll show it to you again later. 1989 was the end of the Cold War. 1991 was the breakup of the Soviet Union. When I first heard that Russia was going to pull out of the Soviet Union, I thought, that's it. That's it for the Soviet Union. And again, many of this military and space technology has been put to peaceful uses. Commercialization of the Russian launch vehicles. This is a Proton rocket with the Zond 5 spacecraft to fly around the moon in 1968. This is a modern Proton launch, putting up commercial communication and weather satellites. Although I should point out, Proton is probably now out of business. There are other commercial launchers that are a lot cheaper, and the last Proton launch probably has happened by now, but there are others. From 1986 to 2001, the Soviets had a big modular space station called Mir, which is Russian for peace. And between 1994 and 1998, the US space shuttles flew to Mir and docked with it. Mir, of course, was designed to dock with a space shuttle. Not the American space shuttle, of course. It was designed to dock with Buran, but Buran was a close enough copy that it worked perfectly well. And from 1998 to now, the Russians have contributed parts and astronauts, or rather cosmonauts, in the International Space Station, which has flown from 1998 to now. There have been people continuously in space, human beings continuously in space for over 20 years now. And this is Vasily Yusashov during a International Space Station mission. Notice he is showing two symptoms of weightlessness, namely what's called puffy face and bird legs. Because of the absence of weight, body fluids in the human body tend to pool upwards. And therefore, astronauts need to be in good shape and need to exercise a lot to keep themselves from basically atrophying so they can still walk when they get back to Earth. A rising star now is China. The Soviet Union is basically no more. Well, the Soviet Union is no more. Russia has had commercial space activity and participation on the International Space Station, but China is very much a rising star. China's program was at first based on Russian space hardware, but now they have developed their own. The first Chinese astronaut, in other words, taikonaut, was Yang Liwei on Shenzhou 5 in 2003. In 2007, China tested an anti-satellite weapon with another US ASAT test in 2008. I wish they wouldn't do that, because if they ever do have a war in space, even if the United States wins decisively and nobody is killed on the ground, they're going to put so much debris in space, it will close the door to space for centuries. So let us hope they do not militarize space any more than they are doing it now. The Tiangong-1 space station flew from 2011 to 2018. Again, it was just a small single space station, similar to the Salyut 1 through 7. Tianyang-2 flew in 2016 to 2019. It was designed to be a technology bed. The Chinese have planned a larger modular space station similar to Mir. This here is Liu Yang, the first woman taikonaut in 2012. NASA is developing the Space Launch System, SLS heavy lift rocket, and the Orion, here is an Orion multi-purpose crew vehicle, basically upgraded versions of the Apollo Saturn V and the Apollo command module. Orion is designed for use in deep space. Missions to the moon and to Mars can carry as many as 7 astronauts. The initial operational capability of IOC, the initial operational configuration for the Space Launch System. NASA loves 3-letter abbreviations, and I'm obliged when talking to you to translate them into English, because you can talk about the, it's easy to start talking about the MPCV on the SLS in its IOC. That's the multi-purpose crew vehicle on the Space Launch System in its initial operational capability. But the initial operational capability of the Space Launch System will have 9.2 million pounds of thrust, more than even the Saturn V, and designs for a heavy lift vehicle to send spacecraft, large spacecraft to Mars is designed to be 11.9 million pounds of thrust, as opposed to 6.7 million pounds of thrust for the Space Shuttle and 7.5 for the Saturn V. So NASA's developing Space Launch System heavy lift rocket and its Orion multi-purpose crew vehicle to fly astronauts around the moon in the 2020s and to Mars in the 2030s. They're going to need to develop landers. I don't know who's going to do this. China plans a large modular space station in 2021. This one that I showed you in the previous one. They say they want to land humans on the moon by 2036. NASA retired the space shuttle in 2011. NASA is now supporting commercial rockets, which began flying astronauts in 2020, just earlier this year, and there's a crew up there now. NASA wants to launch the first woman astronaut on the moon, to land the first woman astronaut on the moon by 2024. Knowing how these things work, I'll give them till 2028. US private industry wants to send humans around the moon in 2023 and around Mars by 2024. And how can we not wish them luck? So the new space race, the old space race was the United States versus the Soviet Union. The new one, the last time humans walked on the moon, Americans were racing the Soviets. The next time it may be Americans racing the Chinese, or it may be the Chinese. There is another race in space happening, though. What's really new is private industry is pulling ahead of government in a second new space race. True, the Air Force has a wing reusable drone vehicle that they're not saying much about. And NASA has plans to send their Orion spacecraft with other things to Mars in the 2030s and to the moon between then. But most of the astronauts will be launched in space on commercial vehicles. The SpaceX Dragon 2, which is flying astronauts to the International Space Station, had a mission earlier this year and has astronauts there right now. Boeing is developing its Starliner. Sierra Nevada is developing a winged reusable vehicle, the Dream Chaser, which you may notice is a copy of the Soviet Spiral interceptor, but not to worry, because the Soviet Spiral interceptor was a copy of an American vehicle developed earlier. Richard Branson is developing this suborbital vehicle for space tourism, Virgin Galactic Spaceship 2. And how can we not wish them luck? Another new thing that people had been talking about, science fiction had been talking about for a long time, is the prospect of commercial resource extraction from the moon. Is the extraction of resources on the moon for commercial purposes coming soonish? This was a scheme described on the 25th anniversary of NASA in 1982. Actually, NASA was started the year after Sputnik 1, 1958, and the 25th anniversary was 1983. And they talked about this, basically mining propellant on the moon. It would make spaceflight into deep space a lot cheaper. So is commercial extraction from the moon coming soonish? Science fiction coming true? Maybe. Take my course, which I will offer next fall, and I'll tell you more about it. What might you do with this course? Build a system like this for mining propellant on the moon to make Mars transporter a lot easier. And with that, I will open up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ringwald, for taking us through both the tragedies, but really the exhilaration of going out into space. And did you want to share also, while students prepare questions, did you want to share a video of the Apollo 4?
Yes, let's see if I can get it working. Let's see if I can get it working. I have not done this before. It is on YouTube. It's a YouTube video of the very first launch of a Saturn V moon rocket. It was, oh, now I have messed everything up. It was the first ever launch, Apollo 4 launch. And come on, video. One of the things, okay, and of course I cannot cut out, the one thing that I wanted was to cut out the commercial. Okay, skip the ad, and there it is. And okay,
Share your screen again.
so I should,
And all the launch support operations well at time at 90 seconds and
let me share the screen. One of the things about Project Apollo was it was some of the best television ever made. Television premiered in the United States in 1948. Throughout the 1950s, more and more people got them. By 1960, just about everybody in America had a TV set. And Project Apollo was in the 1960s, and it was the best TV show in the 60s. Of course, the best fictional TV show was The Twilight Zone in 1959 because the medium of television was sufficiently new to attract the best talent. And this is often in any art form. Often the best stuff happens early on. For example, Shakespeare, some of the best secular theater ever made. But anyway, let me do a share screen and start this out. And the suspense was wonderful.
counting. Houston flight now confirms that they are go for the flight, as are all other aspects of the mission. T-minus 1 minute, 16 seconds and counting. The pressurization continuing within the vehicle at this time. We also have a hydraulic commit that will permit the hydraulics to drive the engines in the first stage. Liquid hydrogen tank in the second stage now pressurizing. T-minus 60 seconds and counting. T-minus 60. Our status board still shows we're go at this time. T-minus 50 seconds and counting. We have transferred to internal power. The transfer is satisfactory. The 6.2 million pound Saturn V launch vehicle now on its own power at 38 seconds and counting. To repeat, the ignition sequence will start at 8.9 seconds. We'll be looking to lift off at 0. T-minus 30 seconds and counting. We'll count down from starting at T-minus 20. T-minus 25. Stage is reporting ready for launch. T-minus 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 5, 4. We have ignition. All engines are running. We have liftoff. We have liftoff at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The tower has...
My God, our building's shaking here. Our building's shaking. Oh, it's terrific. The building's shaking. This big glass window is shaking. We're holding it with our hands. Look at that rocket go into the clouds at 3,000 feet. Oh, it's terrific.
That's right. Veteran news reporter Walter Cronkite losing his composure on camera. Not that they were pointed at him; they were pointed at the rocket being launched. Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America. He was a CBS news anchor from 1963 to 1981, and he had a poker face, meaning that no matter how traumatic the events he was reporting on, he would maintain a calm expression on his face. And this was widely interpreted as the American public that he was being truthful. There's nobody like that today. So whenever he would lose his composure on camera, that was a news event in itself. And this was one of the best examples. He was doing a live broadcast during the first ever launch of a Saturn V moon rocket. No astronauts on board, Apollo 4, just a test flight. It was so loud it tore the roof off the press building in which he was doing a live broadcast from 3 miles away. And the only thing he could do was turn around, look at it, and scream, "Look at that rocket go! This is terrific!" Anyway, let me stop there and answer questions.
Yeah, so we've got a question here. What was the impact of Project Paperclip's German scientists on the United States space programs? And do you know if the USSR had an equivalent German scientist relocation program for their space programs?
Yes, it was. Operation Paperclip was fundamental because the director of the NASA Marshall Space Flight Center was the one and only Werner von Braun, who was the leader of the German efforts to develop the V-2 missile in World War II. The V-2 missile was a terrifying missile. It was the first rocket capable of supporting, of reaching space. It would fly 60 miles up and had a 200-mile range, would carry a 1-ton explosive, high explosive warhead. And Werner von Braun had a nasty habit of saying grossly inappropriate things about it, such as, I was aiming for the moon, but I hit London instead. And well, folks, I would not want to try to explain my enthusiasm for spaceflight for relatives of any of the roughly 30,000 people who were killed by those rockets. This is where Walter Cronkite got interested in space, from reporting in London and being on the receiving end of missile attacks. This USSR did capture a number of V-2 missiles, and Korolev did learn a lot from them. But the United States got most of the scientists, because Werner von Braun and his team of 120 rocket engineers could hear the Soviet artillery in the distance and decided to who will give us the best post-war terms, the Americans probably. As one German soldier said to another while retreating from Russia, if they do to us half of what we did to them, you'll never smile or laugh again. So the Germans decided to, Werner von Braun and his team of German rocket engineers decided to surrender to the Americans. So they were all whisked away, and Stalin was furious about it. Joseph Stalin was furious about it, said this is absolutely unacceptable. They got the rocket scientists. And okay, another question, is there any threat of nuclear war today? You know, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has, since World War II, maintained what they call the doomsday clock. It is a clock set with the minute hand a few minutes towards midnight. We are now the closest we have ever been. We are currently 100 seconds from midnight. I hope, let's put it this way, there probably is not much chance, a lot less chance of a 3,000 megaton exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union like there was well into the 80s. But it really wouldn't take many nuclear weapons falling on the United States to really hurt the country badly. So I hope we need to avoid nuclear war, folks. You get no argument from me. Anyway, any other questions?
I know we'd like to ask one about time travel, since that has to do also with speed that we were talking about before. And is it possible to travel back into time by going fast enough and changing events and coming back?
Well, of course, Einstein's special theory of relativity, which Albert Einstein derived at age 26 while working as a patent clerk, because he couldn't get a teaching job, because he used to ask his professors and his teachers too many questions they couldn't answer. He was kicked out of high school for that. This is why I tell people going into teaching, don't do that. Don't do that. If you have a student who asks too many questions you can't answer, and train the student, teach the student how to look stuff up, and also do some looking up yourself. But Einstein's special theory of relativity is that if you travel really fast at speeds close to the speed of light, you'll travel into the future, and this has been observed. Astronauts age 1/100th of a second per orbit slower than they would if they had stayed on Earth. And that might not sound like much, but if they stay up for 2 weeks, that comes to 100 orbits. So over a second, that's easy to time. You don't need a really accurate clock to do that. So it's been well documented. And of course, any high energy physics lab in the world will observe it every day of the week. But the question of, is it possible to travel backwards in time? And the science fiction fantasy being you could change events and then come back into your own time. The main answer is, well, in science, we settle things by experiment. So until somebody actually puts together a time machine that actually works, we don't really know. Stephen Hawking, famous physicist, used to like to say that if time travel into the past is possible, why do we not see tourists from the future? Stephen Hawking lived in Cambridge, England, which is an attractive place for tourists. We live in Fresno. So maybe nobody wants to come here. One thing, Stephen Hawking had a party for time travelers, and the champagne got warm and the hors d'oeuvres got stale because, of course, he didn't send out the invitations until after the party. He said, because he said, well, if they can travel backwards in time, they all have gotten the invitations. And so why did they come? So the short answer is we don't know. Anyway, are there any other questions? I'm almost completely out of time now.
We're almost completely out of time, but I did have a question on, you noted the role of private industry in space exploration now. And I know there's also been some sort of debate in NASA about the future of space exploration and whether going to Mars is the way to go or going back to the moon. What do you see as the most profitable way forward yourself in terms of space exploration? Is it building a space station out there that we, upping that, or?
For the past 4 years, NASA has been building up a lot of momentum to go to the moon because it would be a very good place to go to develop technology needed to go to Mars. Because getting to the moon, the problem is Mars is 200 times farther away than the moon. It takes 3 days to get to the moon by rocket. The longest of those Apollo missions was 11 days. Takes between 6 and 9 months, depending on when you launch, to get to Mars. And of course, 6 to 9 months to get back. And you're not free to come and go whenever you like. You can only travel between the two planets when the two planets are on the same side of the sun. So astronauts traveling to Mars and intending to return to the Earth would have to spend 6 to 9 months to get there, 6 to 9 months to get back. And in between, they'd have to spend about a year and a half, about 500 days on Mars to wait for the two planets back into line. This is much harder. This is quite a hard thing to do, really pushing the limit of the technology we have available to us now. So going to the moon first to develop a lot of this technology and test a lot of this technology would be very handy. So
And if I just say a final question from a student is asteroid mining feasible?
The Japan Space Agency, JAXA, has just recovered a sample taken from an asteroid. The Hayabusa, their Hayabusa 2 probe went to the asteroid Itokawa and snatched a sample and brought it back to the Earth. So the answer must be yes. Is commercially profitable asteroid mining feasible? I will say maybe. We don't have the technology to do it now, but technology does have a way of developing. If people, let's put it this way, the leaders of private industrial commercial application space, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, are very interested in developing asteroid resources. They haven't done it yet, but they are working on it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ringwald, for being with us here this afternoon. Hopefully we can do this again in the future, but in person. It was a really fascinating lecture, and thank you very much. We will now take a 15-minute break. Yes, big round of applause.
Yeah.
And then we can, yeah.
I want to watch Professor Giddens talk because he's going to talk about music. And I did show a slide of Jimi Hendrix. I wanted to show one of the Beatles, but yes. Okay, well, great.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
We'll take a 15-minute break, and then we'll all come back for our final lecture.